Hey there, welcome back. We're going to continue our endocrine talk. Right now we are on page 31 of the lecture notes, and we're starting with adrenal glands. So probably this whole lecture will be adrenal glands. I'm guessing it'll take a little time. So let's switch over to those lecture notes and take a look at them. Okay, so I put up at the top here that these figures that you see below are on page 623 in your notes, and I actually have them here also for us to look at, figure 1613. And what they're showing here is a microscopic picture of the adrenal gland, and then a nice artist's rendition of them. You also looked at this same slide or a similar slide in lab in week 1. So remind yourself where the adrenal gland is. It is sitting on top of the kidney. It has a medulla and a cortex. Cortex is the outer part. That's the part you're looking at right here in these pictures. The medulla is down here at the very bottom of this picture, and it's in the center. So now let's go back to our notes and talk about some stuff. So each kidney has an adrenal gland above it. The secretions that are coming out of the adrenal gland are kind of dependent on the tissue layers that are there. And so that's one of the reasons why we break these tissue layers up so we can understand what's being secreted from them. So the adrenal cortex has 3 different zones, and you can see these zones over here: the glomerulosa zone, the fasciculata zone, and the reticularis zone. We'll talk about each of those in a minute. It is embryonically derived from mesoderm, okay? And so that is the same embryonic tissue that gives rise to the gonads, and therefore some of the hormones that are going to be released have kind of similar effects. So that's interesting. And then up at the very top there's this fibrous connective tissue capsule that kind of encapsulates the entire adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla is a lot smaller, and it's derived from ectoderm or neural crest cells, so they're more neurologically based than glandular based. And remember, this was where our exception went to in 231, and epinephrine and norepinephrine got released. And so these guys are similar to our postganglionic sympathetic fibers, just like the one that goes to this area. So again, that's kind of interesting. We have a composite gland where 2 different embryological tissues come together to form it. Now, so the topmost layer of the adrenal cortex is the glomerulosa, and you can see up here in the top picture, at the very top of the screen, these little circular structures, and so we've made them bigger here so you can see them. And those are glomeruli, which are just like little globe-like or round ball-like structures of cells. And they're made up of these round balls, and they secrete mineral corticoids, and the main hormone that we're interested in is aldosterone. And you remember, we've learned about aldosterone already. It helps with fluid balance and mineral concentrations, solute concentrations like sodium. So we'll, on the next couple pages, talk more about that. So right now we're just doing an overview. The second zone, the middle zone, is the fasciculata, and the reason it's called that is that it's made up of these straight cords, which are called fascicles, and so you can see going up and down here, there are these up and down cords. And these secrete glucocorticoids, and especially the one that we're most concerned with is cortisol, although also cortisone and corticosterone. All right, and these guys increase blood glucose levels, and they also are trying to type something in, doesn't want me to. What's going on here? Huh. All right, well, I'll draw it in. Not sure what's going on. We will, oh, there, did it finally there, but it's all right. We'll regulate stress. And this is one of our stress hormones, helps with stress situations. We'll talk about that also in a couple pages. The third innermost zone of the cortex is the reticularis. And the reticularis looks kind of similar to the fasciculata, but the things, instead of being straight cords in the reticularis, they are branched freely and net-like. And so notice these open spaces that you see here. And when you look at them under the microscope, you can see the same thing. You can see they're not as arranged as regular, and so they're easy to identify. This area secretes gonatocorticoids. And so now you understand why this area is derived from the same tissue as gonads. Mostly male hormones like androgens, like DHEA, and DHEA can be converted at the tissues to testosterone, also glucocorticoids, but testosterone is the primary one. So it's going to have some same effects that testosterone does. All right, and so let's go back now, and we'll start back up at the top, and we'll talk about the mineralocorticoids, and specifically we're going to talk about aldosterone. And some of this is review, and there's a little more detail in here than probably we need to get into right now. Some of this we'll come back and talk about in the kidney, so I'm going to try to make this make the most sense. We'll see how I do without going into too much detail, which is always a challenge. All right, so aldosterone, if you remember, was released as a result of a bunch of different things. Angiotensin could be released. It would cause aldosterone to be released. High potassium or low sodium levels, and those are the ones we talked about. You also might remember that it's inhibited by AMP. It works opposite of AMP. And so then what were some of the target cells? And we went over these. I had a little slide that if you were in my lecture, and we went over these. So one place was the afferent arterioles of the kidneys, and that vasoconstricted those. Those are the ones that go into the glomerulus. Do you remember these? And that would reduce filtration, which means urine production would go down. And then the key thing is if urine production went down, blood volume would go up and blood pressure would go up, right? Sorry, there's a little 2 here. You can ignore that. Another target was the hypothalamus, and was looking specifically, the target was having the hypothalamus release ADH. And remember, ADH is going to bring water back from the collecting ducts in the distal convoluted tubule, and so urine production again will go down. And what happens when that occurs? Exact same thing. So if in both of these cases, more fluid is kept in the blood. Okay, for both of these. So we'll put it right there in the center. Okay, so that's good. So we're bringing fluid back. That's what aldosterone does for us. Brings fluid back into the blood, gets blood volume up. Okay, and then also another place that it targeted were the kidneys, and it targeted the collecting ducts and the distal convoluted tubule as well, although that's not listed here. And it would increase absorption of sodium. So if our sodium levels were low, we'd bring sodium back. And if you remember what happens, and the reason why this blood volume and blood pressure happens, is that water follows the sodium, and because of that, we get increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. Also, renin was released, and we would get blood volume and blood pressure as well. And this was mainly due, if you recall, mainly due to the vasoconstrictors, so increases in PR. And if you don't remember what PR is, that's peripheral resistance. So we did get a little blood volume increase, but mainly blood pressure increase due to peripheral resistance increase. And then lastly, aldosterone even targeted just regular peripheral vessels, and that did the same thing. That increased vasoconstriction and increased resistance, or another way to say that is increased PR, peripheral resistance, right? The same thing as resistance, and that will make blood pressure go up. So notice in all of these cases, blood pressure goes up, blood pressure goes up, blood pressure goes up. So aldosterone's bringing back fluids and vasoconstricting to bring blood pressure up. Now, aldosterone affects some other things too. Let's type that in. It kind of jumps to this next thing, and it might be unclear here. Let's see. All right, let's put it here. Okay. Aldosterone also affects pH balance. And it does this in two different ways, okay? So the first one is, remember in 232 we talked about balancing charge when we were with our chloride shift. Remember, if we were making bicarb and we were making a negatively charged ion, we needed to swap it with a chloride so there wouldn't be charge across membranes. A similar thing happens with aldosterone. So if sodium is coming back into the blood, right, we're putting in a lot of positively charged ions. And so what we can do is we can swap them with another positively charged ions and make it go out into the urine. So if the sodium goes into the blood, we can have hydrogen protons leave the blood and enter the urine. And this helps with raising blood pH, because remember, the less hydrogen protons we have, the more our blood gets more towards basic, right? It'll go away from acidic state to a basic state. And so one thing to think about here, and we can type in, is that we're balancing the charge out. Balancing the charge out. All right, by doing this, and as a result, we help our pH. Now also, the exact same thing can kind of happen, but in a different way, whereas if we take positively charged ions into the blood, another thing we can do is we can also, instead of swapping positively charged hydrogen protons and switch them out, we can draw negative ions out of the urine and into the blood, and especially we can bring in things like chloride, which is an anion, right? But also remember HCO3 is our bicarbonate buffer, and it can accept excess hydrogens or other acids and take them out of solution. So that's interesting that aldosterone, it's doing a lot of blood volume, blood pressure things, but because it's bringing sodium back, we can have a swapping occur and get things that we like bicarb, into the blood, and we can get things we don't like hydrogen protons, out of the blood. So that's great. And this is a way that I could visually show that and write a bunch of stuff, and I think I'm not, because it can be very messy and complicated to try to do this. And so I think what I just said there is probably enough for you to understand what I want you to get across, okay? And then, again, we already just mentioned this, and so I don't want to go too much more into it, but aldosterone played a role with the renin-angiotensin mechanism, and the way that it played that role, remember, is that once renin got released and we had vasoconstrictor release, we also released aldosterone, and aldosterone reabsorbed the sodium, and these went up because water follows salt, and that results in these two things there. Okay, so somewhat of a repeat of what we said earlier, but it's fine to put it in another time. Down here at the bottom also is kind of a reminder of that renin-angiotensin mechanism and how it ended up working. Um, and so we can underline a couple things. So let's say we have a lot of solute concentration, like in the filtrate of our urine. So in filtrate in kidneys, right? So say we have a lot of sodium, for example. That's one of the things that causes renin to be released. When renin gets released, remember we had angiotensinogen that was made in the liver, and then renin was our enzyme from the kidney, right? So we have all these different places, if you're remembering where things were. So this is coming from the liver. Kidney releases renin. Renin converts angiotensinogen, like a precursor in molecule, into angiotensin 1. And if you remember, angiotensin 1 was a weak vasoconstrictor. Okay, and then angiotensin converting enzyme converts that weak vasoconstrictor, and remember, it does this primarily in the lungs, to angiotensin 2, a powerful vasoconstrictor. And that means, again, that we have an increase in peripheral resistance, right? Which gives us an increase in blood pressure. Okay, vasoconstrictors make the vessel wall smaller. That creates peripheral resistance to go up. That increases blood pressure. Okay, so a little review there, which hopefully was helpful and reminded you of a few things of aldosterone. Now we're going to talk about one other thing that impacts aldosterone, and this is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So remember, this is the one that stimulates the cortex, right? And so what does it do? It has a minor effect on aldosterone secretions, okay? So when we release this from the anterior pituitary, right, it has a minor effect on aldosterone secretions and increased, so that means increased release of ACTH will increase aldosterone. So this is one way we can get a little extra aldosterone, as if we're releasing ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Now remember also that ANP is its counter. It's antagonist. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to write here that ANP counters the previous systems, meaning all the systems that we just talked about. Because what does ANP do? ANP lowers blood pressure. Remember, it got released from atrial fibers as a result of overstretching, and that was usually due to lots of blood volume. It would target the adrenals, and it would say, let's produce less aldosterone. So if we produce less aldosterone, aldosterone can't do the things it would do, and so instead of aldosterone reabsorbing sodium, we'll say sodium, oops, can I bring that up so it's, let's see if I can, okay, let's put it down here instead, if you don't mind. We'll put it over here and then I'll write it in, sorry. I only have limited places in which this will work. Okay, sodium stays in the urine, and as a result, water follows. So water stays in urine, and if water stays in the urine, that means that blood volume is going to go down and blood pressure is going to go down. So if we have less aldosterone release, then sodium will stay in the urine. Water will stay in the urine with it because water follows salt. and that will cause a reduction, the opposite of all the other things that we've been talking about so far. Now, there's a summary of all of this on page 624. Summary on page 624. And it's a lot of the things that we just talked about. Okay, and I'll show you a picture of it really quickly, and you can kind of go. So if you want, look at it. If not that, where is it? There. Yeah, here it is. So these are the aldosterone release regulators, and we talked about all of these already. The renin-angiotensin system, potassium, as well as sodium. Right, if potassium's high and sodium's low, that does it. So it's just talking about potassium here, but remember sodium is a player as well. ACTH we just talked about, and then ANP works opposite of it, right? It has an inhibitory effect. So the nice thing here is it just kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff that we just said. If that's useful to you, if that visual helps, and you can put that all together, great. That's a good way to look at it. Now, a couple abnormalities. Hyperaldosteronism. So high amounts of aldosterone released. So think about what happens if that's the case. We're going to bring back lots of sodium. And so then what's going to happen to the potassium? Because remember, they tend to go in opposite of each other. So if the potassium is there, that means that potassium, goes out to the urine. If we lose a lot of potassium, that can be probably a problem because potassium is used in our electrical excitability of neurons and muscle cells. And so we can get things like muscle weakness. So we don't want that. So we don't want to have too much aldosterone be secreted because we might have problems with our nervous systems and our muscle systems. Now, what if we don't have enough aldosterone secreted? So now the opposite would happen. We don't get a lot. We get less sodium and water reabsorption. These are supposed to, we have some errors in arrows here. So as a result, we would get lower blood volume and lower blood pressure, right? If the water and the sodium stay in the urine and not come back, so we can type that into sodium and water stay in the urine, okay, then we're going to have low blood volume and low blood pressure, right? Will also then mean that we'll get a lot of potassium staying in the blood instead of getting rid of some, and that can cause serious heart toxicity, okay, and can lead to heart failure. All right, so that one was long because aldosterone does so many different things, and we've already learned a little about it, so we wanted to cover that one in detail. Okay, so now what I want to mention here with this Addison's disease picture is I'm not going to go over Addison's disease entirely, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say review yourself and I'll explain what it is really quickly, and then we'll go to the other two parts of the cortex. So Addison's disease is where all hormones in the adrenal cortex are lacking. Do you see the word lack there? So we could also put in deficiency. Did I spell that right? Deficiency or a lack of all of the hormones in the adrenal cortex. So something's destroyed the entire adrenal cortex. Tuberculosis is one of these, or autoimmune disorders. And so if you don't have those hormones, you're going to have problems. So we just talked about all the things aldosterone does, right? So this would be the same thing as this hypoaldosteronism. But in addition to that, you'd also not be producing androgens. We're going to get to those in a minute. And cortisol. We're going to get to those in a minute. So you would have all of these things happening at one time. So it's a pretty hard disease on your body. And we'll talk about these other things, and you can think about them as we go through. What would happen if you have low androgens? What would happen if you had low cortisol? So we're going to do cortisol next, actually. So the glucocorticoids that are produced in the fasciculata, as we mentioned before, there's a couple: cortisol or hydrocortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. Okay, but cortisol is the most abundant and significant, and so I tend to just use cortisol as our example. So I'm going to just refer to cortisol quite a bit. And what does cortisol do? Well, it maintains normal metabolism and resistance to stress. So cortisol is released normally in your body, and it helps with our daily metabolism rates, kind of similar to how T3, T4 does metabolism also. And you'll notice that some of the things are similar with those. It also helps when we're under stressful situations mobilize the things we need to get through those stressful situations. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the normal metabolism thing, cortisol secretions are diurnal, and they're related to sleep-wake, all right? So they start to go up in the morning and they go down at night, all right? So what are one of the things, if we want to kind of, in the morning, you're waking up, you can think of waking up as a stressful situation, right? Your body was in a parasympathetic state, and now you're forcing it to go into a sympathetic state. And so cortisol levels start to increase in the morning. And so one of the things that it'll do right away is it wants to get glucose, fats, and proteins in your blood. So it will increase the levels of those things in your blood right away. So we have some fuel, and we have some building blocks and other things that we can use for fuel in our blood. Okay. It's also activated by sympathetics during physical or mental stress. Okay. And this is when you're under a stressful situation, maybe someone you know is, let's suppose, like we just had an example where someone that we know who's been sick had to be rushed to the hospital, and took an ambulance to the hospital, and we were really concerned about their well-being, and so we were stressed mentally, and as a result we probably released some cortisol, and the reason is that cortisol is going to allow your body to get through the stressful time by helping it do things like release glucose, make sure there's enough glucose available, if needed, break down fats and proteins to also use them as fuel, and minimize certain things that we don't need to deal with at that moment, like repair the tissues of our body or have our immune system working perfectly. Instead, it's going to really focus on the exact moment where you're in the stressful situation and getting out of it. Okay, so one of the big things that it does then is we want to maintain blood sugar levels, right? If we don't maintain blood sugar levels, then we won't be able to get through this stressful situation because we won't have enough, enough fuel. Also, it reduces tissue repair. It kind of stops our tissue repair process because we're focused on other things, and it inhibits the immune system. It depresses it just temporarily until the cortisol levels go back to normal. But that can be a problem sometimes. And as I was just going to say, let's suppose you have someone that you care for or a family member who gets sick and they rush to the hospital, and you're there a couple of nights with them, and you're staying up late and you're not getting a lot of sleep. And during that time, your blood sugar levels are being maintained. You might not be eating as much as you think you are, but your body's taking care of it by releasing glucose and all this stuff. But one of the problems is that you're not taking very good care of your body. And so what often happens is when that week is over and the person's out of the hospital, your immune system's low and you get sick. A virus, gets into your body or something, and there you go. So that's the one problem with high levels of cortisol for extended periods of time. It's great in the short term, but it's because it's helped mobilizing our body, but it's not very good in the long term. Now, let's look at a couple other things here. It says it's released cyclically or normally by the by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. We already talked about how it did that. Remember, CRH was released from the hypothalamus, and then it went through the portal system and it went to the anterior pituitary, and then ACTH was released, and it had negative feedback process. So that was all review, right? And sorry, I'm looking at something. Yeah, so I wanted to point out before I go through this that there's a nice focus figure in the book now, and it is on page, I don't think it's here, I'm going to have to probably find it here in a second. It's probably, probably on the next view here. Sometimes these focus figures are at the end in the ebook. Yeah, here it is. Focus figure 6.2, stress in the adrenal gland. And so this is going to talk a lot about the cortisol and what's happening and ACTH. And so you can read this, and this will be a really helpful review. Okay, and talks about long-term effects and everything. And that's on page 628. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go through our written notes about it, but you might want to look at both. Okay, so one thing that's really important here is we said we want to maintain glucose levels. So there's a term you need to learn, gluconeogenesis. So break it down. Glucose, neo, new, genesis, creation. So what that word means is make new glucose. Okay? And we can make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Obviously, we get a lot of glucose from things like starch in our diet. We can break the starch down into glucose. But your body can also convert other things like proteins and fats into glucose as well. So that's what it does. So we can, if we needed to, in a stressful situation, we can do catabolism of our proteins, like in our muscles, and we can turn those into amino acids, and then those amino acids can be made into new glucose. We can also take fats, and we can do lipolysis, break apart fat, and we can turn those into fatty acids or ketones. We'll talk about ketones a little later. And that will also allow you to use these and turn them into glucose. So we can use these in gluconeogenesis again. Okay? And then, of course, we can take carbohydrates at the liver, like glycogen, and we can break down glycogen into glucose. Okay, so that one is pretty straightforward. So we've mentioned cortisol is released during stress, and there's a bunch of stress things that we can think about. And hypothalamus will detect and start cycle for its release, detect if we're in one of these situations, right? And then what I'm going to put here, and this is the part about the inflammatory stuff all the way down to this, is what all these things are talking about is that cortisol shuts down immune and repair functions. Okay, so let's look at a couple of these. It decreases inflammatory effects. Excuse me. It does so by inhibiting histamine. Okay, so that's one thing. It inhibits lymphocyte production, especially T lymphocytes. So those are our white blood cells that fight off infection. It depresses phagocytosis. Our macrophages aren't as kind of good as they should be. It reduces chemotaxis to injured sites. Do you remember that? Chemotaxis is where there's an injured site and there's chemicals being released due to the injured site. Like, let's say there's bacteria in an area and they're breaking down the tissues. So some of those chemicals float around, and the macrophages can detect those chemicals and then go towards them. That depresses fever. And remember, fever is actually a good thing in your body. It's trying to make an environment where bacteria or viruses aren't working as well. And so that could be a problem as well. And it even decreases osteoblastic activity, and if you remember, that means building bone, right? So this is bone building and repair. So all of these things that are bracketed by the blue there, they are because cortisol shuts down immune and repair functions. Okay. Now, there is one useful thing about cortisol that's because of this. So I'm going to write this is useful. Useful. Okay. And this useful thing that I'm talking about is you can use cortisol because it depresses your immune system. You can use it as a treatment after transplant surgery. The immune system is lower, and therefore the chances of rejection is less. So people will get cortisol in that case if we need to depress the immune system. Okay, so now if we have a deficiency of everything, that is Addison's disease. We talked about that previously. Not just a deficiency in cortisol, but a deficiency in all three of the zones in the cortex. Excess is Cushing's disease, and I just will put a little note here for Cushing's disease. It says next page because we're going to talk about it briefly on the next page here. Actually, is it 2 pages? Yeah, 2 pages, sorry. And again, you can read Cushing's here and kind of figure out what would probably happen, because Cushing's is, see if I can highlight this over the color. Cushing's is elevated blood levels of cholesterol. And so this just lists all the different things that it could do. Now, you don't have to memorize them, but just get an understanding that Cushing's is elevated levels of cortisol. I said cholesterol again, didn't I? That's so funny. Cortisol, elevated blood levels of cortisol. And Addison's is lowered levels of cortisol as well as other hormones. Okay, now we have one more thing to talk about, and we'll do it really quickly. This is getting to be a long video, and this is the gonatocorticoids, the sex hormones. And remember, that was from our reticular region, and we want to talk about that now. So DHEA, which is this precursor that can be converted into either testosterone or estrogen as needed in the body. That will increase sex drive if we have more testosterone and estrogen, and it will also cause development of secondary sex characteristics that we see during puberty, like muscle and fat distribution changes, vocal cord changes, breast tissue development, or gonad development, things like that. In females, it does provide some estrogen during menopause, so even though the ovaries aren't producing estrogen, there is a little bit of estrogen that is still in the body, and it does probably contribute to libido and other sexual behaviors in females as well, because there's this a little bit of estrogen being produced. All right, so abnormalities. Well, one of them is androgenital syndrome, which is virilism or masculinization. And this is usually more noticeable in females or in prepubescent boys. And this is where we would have a large amount of these hormones, these gonatocorticoids, being released. And so if you were a female or a prepubescent boy, you might develop masculine adult characteristics, and early development of secondary sex characteristics and sex drive. All right, so that one kind of makes sense, and that's all we're going to talk about there. So the last thing, and then we're going to stop, and we're going to pick up with pancreas in our next lecture, is the adrenal medulla. And so we've gone through all 3 zones of the cortex, and now we're in the adrenal medulla. And you already know a little bit about this because we talked about the adrenal medulla back in 231. We already told you also, just earlier, that it's the neurocrest tissue is where it comes from, and that's the same source as the sympathetic nervous system cells, right? And these cells are directly stimulated by the preganglionic fibers of the ANS. This was our exception. Remember, our exception from 231. Back again. Okay? And that allows for a very rapid response in stimuli because there was no synapsing. We just directly stimulated here. And what did we do? Well, if you recall, we released epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And you also might remember those are called amines. That's one of the hormone groups, right? Those little monoamines. Okay. This will intensify, the release of these intensifies the actions that are already produced by the sympathetics. And most of this is due to epinephrine. So I'm going to write mostly due to epi. Okay. These guys right here. Increased blood pressure, increased respiration rate, increased blood sugar levels, decreased digestive system. Anything that would be sympathetic is going to be increased here. Norepinephrine helps with these effects, but has a bigger influence on peripheral vasoconstriction than epinephrine does. So that's interesting. One of the abnormalities is a pheochromocytoma. And this is a chromaffin cell tumor, and these cells here are chromaffin cells. There's a little note of that. I didn't mention it, but these cells right here are the chromaffin cells right there. And what this does is this gets a hypersecretion of catecholamines, there's epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it produces a massive out-of-control sympathetic response. And you can imagine what that would be like. Your heart rate would be racing, your respiratory rate would go up, your body temperature would increase, you'd mobilize all this blood sugar into your blood, things like that. So it could be quite problematic. All right, so we're done with adrenals. That one takes a while because there's so many hormones in the adrenal glands. So what you should be doing is reviewing each area of the adrenal gland, what kind of hormones are released there and how they impact the body, where are the target cells of the for those hormones and what do they do for the body. That's a good way to review. Okay, we're going to pick up next lecture on pancreas and spend the entire time probably talking about that. That one takes a little bit of time also. All right, great. Thank you.